Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We are staring at one of the more chaotic and, quite frankly, exciting off seasons that we've seen in this sport in a very long time. And it starts with the fact that some of the best jobs that this sport has to offer are currently available. You're going to see a lot of coaching movement. At the same time, you're going to see a lot of player movement as well. Now, with Brian Kelly getting fired by LSU late Sunday night, the conversation is now, out of the jobs that are currently available at the Power Four level, what are the most attractive jobs that we see? The best part about this conversation is, and I got a bunch of boys in a group chat, they're all monster college football fans. Everybody's got a little bit of a different take. Y'all let it rip in the comment section. I'm going to give you my best jobs available. And look, it's very subjective, it's very opinionated. Y'all let it rip in the comment section. Appreciate you guys. And look, if you are a fan of the off-season movement, we going to have a lot to talk about over the next couple of weeks and months. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with what I think is the best job available. That's LSU. For me, it's a multitude of different reasons. I think most notably, you've had three different coaches in the last 25 years win a national championship. And then I look at all the resources that Brian Kelly had at his disposal over the last couple of years and say, all right, when the defense wasn't working, Brian Kelly was given $2 million a year to go and bring in Blake Baker. When the personnel wasn't working on defense, Brian Kelly was given a war chest to go out and address those needs in the portal. There was nothing in Brian Kelly's way besides himself that prohibited him from competing at the highest level that the sport has to offer. I also think down there in the state of Louisiana at LSU, it might be the best in-state recruiting advantage that you see. I mean, Brian Kelly, one of the biggest concerns that I had about Brian Kelly going down to the state was, could he continue to lock down the state on the recruiting trail? It's a very talented state of high school players. You're not really competing against any other in-state programs. Even Brian Kelly was able to recruit the state of Louisiana. You know, if you are a stud football player down there in that state, you dream about playing for LSU. And so whatever coach comes to LSU, he ain't going to have that much of an issue recruiting the state. You also have access to Florida. You also have access to Texas as well. Now, I'll look at LSU and say, you should routinely have top 5 recruiting classes in the country. You're given the resources necessary to address the rest of the concerns you might have in the transfer portal. In my opinion, Brian Kelly was given everything, and he just couldn't get it done. Now, number 2 is Florida. And I'll say this, I mean, I'll look at LSU and Florida. To me, I think they're clearly the two best jobs available. And that, I think there might be some Penn State fans that push back, and we'll get into Penn State and where they fall in a second. But I look at Florida and say, look, again, really, really talented state down there for high school football. Number 2, I look at Billy Napier and say, similar to Brian Kelly, I think Billy Napier was given a lot of resources. You talk about the player retention that Florida was able to have. They took a lot of guys. They didn't necessarily go out into the transfer portal and grab a bunch of players, but they were able to keep a lot of guys that very well could have gone to the NFL, and they kept them down in Gainesville. You have access to some of the best talent across the country in the state of Florida, up into the state of Georgia. Obviously, you have a very storied program when it comes to winning. I guess the best argument you can make when you're evaluating the Florida job is that when everybody's pulling in the right direction and you have the right guy running the program, we all remember what this Florida program has looked like when it's firing on all cylinders. You know, you haven't had the right guy running this program in a little bit. So I think there's a lot of maybe newer college football fans that look at Florida and say, what the hell are you talking about? Penn State's had a ton of more success than Florida has the last decade. I think from a high end conversation, I think Florida gives you a little bit of high end ability, which is a nice segue to Penn State. Why do I have Penn State at number 3? What is the real ceiling for Penn State as a program? I think you can win a national championship at Penn State. I think James Franklin had a roster in 2025. Heck, they were in the semifinals last year. They put themselves in a spot to compete for a national championship. But I also look at Penn State and say, James Franklin, during his last 10 years running the program, they only had two top 10 high school recruiting classes in the last 10 years. They never really did a ton of damage going to the transfer portal and supplementing their roster either. I'm leaving the James Franklin era and say, just how much firepower does Penn State have when it comes to talent acquisition? As much as people wanted to bang the table for James Franklin not getting over the hump and beating a team like Ohio State, Penn State's never recruited to that level. They've always been a step below. Now, the question I have to ask is that a program problem or was that a James Franklin problem? That's the conversation. But I'll say this, I think LSU and Florida, from a roster building standpoint, they have access to that top end roster. Penn State put together a really good roster. And I think James Franklin was a really good football coach, made some really good hires on the defensive side of the football. Manny Diaz, Jim Knowles didn't work as much, but Tom Allen as well. I guess my question is, Penn State at certain times feels like it's a step below a program like Ohio State. When I look at LSU and Florida and say when everything's firing on all cylinders, I don't view them as a step below a program like Alabama, Georgia, or Texas. The other thing with Penn State that maybe concerns some Penn State fans is with the new shape of the Big Ten. You always kind of took a backseat to Ohio State. At times took a backseat to Michigan as well. Probably taking a backseat to Oregon with the new look of the Big Ten. I'll say this about USC. I know they haven't had a ton of success, but they got the right guys building this roster now. I think USC is going to be certainly a threat in the Big Ten. You have Curt Cignetti in Indiana that seem like they're rocketing up the Big Ten power rankings. Where does Penn State sit as a program in the Big Ten right now? I don't think they're in front of Ohio State. I don't think they're in front of Michigan. I don't think they're in front of Oregon. And I wouldn't be surprised if a team like Indiana and USC can assert themselves above Penn State over the next couple of years as well. It's still, it's a premier program, one of the most recognizable programs that you see across the country. What's the real ceiling of that program? I think could be a fair question to ask. And again, here's what I want to focus on. Is that a James Franklin problem or a Penn State program problem? It could be a James Franklin problem. And you get a guy that can bring in some more talent and use the portal more effectively. Maybe the perceived problems I have about the program cease to exist a little bit. Number 4, Florida State. Look, we all know what Florida State can be as a program. Like there are not a lot of programs that have won national championships in the last 2 decades. Florida State's one of them, right? Mike Norvell has set this program back, and there's no if, and, or buts around it. You're taking a backseat to Miami on the recruiting trail. You're taking a backseat to Florida in the state. You're taking a backseat to Georgia, Alabama. They're going down into the state of Florida, doing what they want in the state. Mike Norvell has made some really bad hires, has not gone about his business in a good way, building this roster, far too reliant on the transfer portal and just ignoring the high school ranks. There's been a lot of bad from Mike Norvell and Florida State over the last couple of years, but I will say this. Mike Norvell always had the firepower to go out and bring in a lot of new players in the portal. They're just missing on a lot of the guys they're bringing in. They're not recruiting the high school ranks. They're not developing their high school players all that well. Because of that, you're seeing a program that's in some real turmoil. You get the right guy running this program, I think Florida State becomes a very good job. And I'm not all that concerned about the conference realignment when it comes to Florida State. When it's time for Florida State to make a move, whether that's in 5 years or 10 years, Florida State's a big enough brand where they're going to land on their feet wherever they might be. I think that's a clear top 4. And I actually feel really confident with the ordering that I put those 4 programs. When you get outside the top 4, that's when it gets a little bit more tricky, and I think it depends on what you might be looking for. Arkansas at 5, I think they have the highest ceiling when it comes to building a roster. Number 1, you're in the SEC. You have some tradition of winning with this program, although it hasn't been great the last couple of years. I think there can be some energy around this program. I don't think Sam Pittman was the right guy to run this program in the current era of the sport. And what I mean by that is I ain't much of a basketball guy, but I know Coach Cal came to Arkansas and was given everything he needed to really get Arkansas's basketball program back going in the right direction. Look, Arkansas cares about football. And if you get a coach that can bring some energy to the donors and energy to the boosters, I think there's a clear gap between the top programs in the SEC and Arkansas. I think Arkansas with the right guy can close that gap pretty well. And I just think you need the right guy to kind of put some energy into this program. It's just kind of been a dead man walking program over the last couple of years. And Sam Pittman clearly was not the guy to get the investment around this program necessary. I mean, you bring in a guy like Rhett Lashley or a young guy that can drum up some energy around this program. I'm not saying they'll be LSU. I think Arkansas can be a little bit more competitive than people might think. Virginia Tech at 6. It's a football first school that has a history of winning. You know, that there's a lot to like about Virginia Tech. The allure of this program has seemed to dim a little bit. That's just my take looking at this program, right? You are seeing some other teams stake or other programs, I should say, take strides over Virginia Tech. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up watching a Virginia Tech team that was pretty routinely winning a lot of big games and had some of the best game day environments, of which they still do have. And I was watching that game Friday night against Cal. These fans care about this program. It does feel like they have significantly dropped in terms of where that program sits in the modern era of the sport. Oklahoma State out there in the Big 12. Look, we've seen Oklahoma State. You're very similar to Virginia Tech. It's a football and maybe wrestling school first. They care about the sport. You got to get a guy that's going to embrace this era of the sport. I think there's some juice to Oklahoma State. You got to have the right guy running this program. But I look at the landscape of the Big 12, and I'll look at what Texas Tech is doing, and I'll look at what Arizona State is doing with Kenny Dillingham, and I'm saying I don't know where Oklahoma necessarily sits in the Big 12 pecking order. UCLA at 8, to me, they squandered an opportunity. When Lincoln Riley first came to USC, he wasn't recruiting the state. There is so much high school talent in the state of California, and USC was largely ignoring it, right? And I thought UCLA had an opportunity to really take advantage of that, and they didn't. And now they're looking for a new head coach. But at the same time, now USC has kind of gotten their ducks in a row a little bit. They're starting to recruit the state of California a hell of a lot better than when Lincoln Riley first got there. If USC continues to trend in the direction they're trending from a talent acquisition standpoint, you get a little bit concerned about UCLA. And I think the buy-in, how much that school cares about the football program is certainly a question mark as well. That's what makes this job so interesting. If UCLA goes out and grabs Jedd Fisch and convinces Jedd Fisch that he can come down to UCLA and have more success than he's having at Washington, like that tells me maybe UCLA is ready to pour the necessary resources into this program. I got to see it before I believe it. And then Stanford at 9. Those are the 8 jobs, including Florida State. It's 9 that are available. This is how I would rank them. LSU and Florida, to me, are the top 2 jobs on the market. I think Penn State is a pretty clear 3rd. And I think Florida State, if comes available, will be a pretty damn clear 4th. I think there's a clear 4. Then there's a gap. And then you have some other programs that, look, I think those jobs could be exciting. You got to get the right guy in there. We'll close it out there. Y'all let it fly in the comment section. These are my takes right off the bat. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.